biodiversity COP. And given that biodiversity loss and climate change are intertwined, are both deeply existential challenges. A large delegation this time of around 25 people, many of whom are here. And a lot went on. Those of you who are sort of really plugged into it will realise that, as always, it's several different stories emerged, different narratives that had a big objective to make some major decisions on the financing of nature protection and recovery, some major decisions that needed to be made on what to do with digital sequencing information or genetic information, and also major decisions to be made on a global biodiversity monitoring framework. Some of that was left to the final hour. Major decisions weren't made on those things. However, there's a lot goes on. You've got all the negotiations, and it was a huge agenda to get through. And we have different members of the delegation were following different aspects of the negotiations and of that agenda and the agenda. And some of the audience here in the panel, and we're going to be talking about their take on what happened with those. But then you've got the whole action agenda. So all the NGOs and the researchers and government organisations that aren't directly involved in the negotiations, and the corporate sector, businesses, financial institutions, a huge sort of ecosystem of organisations who, through a series of side events, present their findings, build momentum, share, network, and so forth. So you've got all of that going on. And actually, this COP for biodiversity was the largest biodiversity COP that there has been. So more engagement, much more going on in this action track. The negotiations were as they were, but the action track grew massively. Considerably smaller, and as someone who's gone to a lot of climate change COPs, it's considerably smaller nonetheless to the climate change one, but there was a lot going on there, and I found that actually there's lots of really interesting things to report back from that as well. So in this discussion, and hopefully with your involvement as well, we'll be able to cover, some of the major things that went on in the action track and some of the major things that went on in the negotiations, and then where does that leave us? What next? What do we want to do together or independently in 2025 in the build up to the Belém, the COP30, the climate change COP in Belém, which is going to be a big one for nature as well as climate change. So what we're going to do is we're going to give 4 minutes, and I'm going to have to be really strict on the 4-minute thing because I'm very, very keen to get inputs to be able to, opportunity for you to share as well as you to ask questions and hopefully others to be able to answer them. So 4 minutes each from our panelists here, people who are really involved and following things, and then we will go to a general round of questions. And then if we've got time, we'll then talk about wrapping that up, what next, and so on. So hopefully that makes sense as a structure. Ideally, we'd all be sort of, sitting in a big circle and discussing this rather than this sort of third wall format. But hopefully you'll just come in with your observations when we get to the Q&A section. So yeah, let's start off. Gudvinda, it'd be great to hear your take. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Great, thanks, Nat. So I was there. This is the first time I've been to a biodiversity COP. I've been to about 3 or 4 climate ones, including Paris and Copenhagen and some of the others. And I went under, my own badge was out under the Natural History Museum of London, of which I'm a trustee. So I was partially there to support the Natural History Museum's activities, but also trying to understand how Oxford engages at the moment, and also what potential there is for Oxford to engage in this process in the future. So it was partially an education thing for me to see that. And for most of the rest of the panel, you'll hear about different aspects of the discussions and what came out of them. So I thought I'd focus a bit more on what happens outside of the discussions as well. I wrote a blog about this if you want to pursue some of those thoughts a bit further. Really, partially because I think that these discussions are hugely important, and I don't want to downplay how important they are, because I think what's happening there is the painful, slow emergence of a global architecture on how we deal with biodiversity and meet this challenge of halting and reversing the decline of biodiversity. And that's inevitably slow and painful and frustrating because you have to have all these voices and all these players on board. And so the news is always going to be disappointment to some extent, because those things take time to do, and maybe they haven't got the time they need in terms of the urgency of the challenges we face. But that's a different issue. But I think beyond those formal discussions, there's a lot that goes on that's really, really important. And sometimes the formal discussions grab all the newspaper headlines and the attention, partially because that's what the meeting is originally designed around, but also that's where you see the dramas, the geopolitics play out. It's easier for journalists and others to pick up on those and then to to tell the stories there. Whereas what's going on beneath is much more amorphous, much more difficult and complicated to track and follow. And so that doesn't get the newspaper headlines, but I think it's just as important, or possibly in some ways even more important. And the two aspects I'll focus on, and one is what happens more widely in the blue zone, but also in the green zone, which is the public accessible zone. And that's essentially, it's what I'd say is a conference on biodiversity that brings together both academics, governments, businesses, NGOs, journalists, indigenous peoples, a whole range of people into lots of small formats of meetings, typically of 10 to 50 people in a room talking through these issues. And there's nowhere I've come across in academia where I can sit in a room so effortlessly that involves businesses, governments, indigenous peoples, a range of things in the same room, trying to understand and connect across our different perspectives. And so it's hugely important, I think. And it might sound a little bit of a superfluous. So why is this some sort of fringe festival going on around the negotiations? No, I don't think it is. I think it's actually as important as the negotiations themselves. And for a number of reasons, I think a lot of what I see from the scientific community was that this was the COP where the community is trying to reach the challenge set in Montreal of how, if we're setting these targets, how do we actually measure biodiversity at scale? How do we bring all of these different metrics and tools together? What are the challenges around that? And there's some fantastic sessions I went to on Science Policy Interface that looked and explored those challenges, but also showed the progress in the last 2 years in these big global efforts on data coming together and moving forward. Other things I saw were announcements, things. So one thing I went to was Brazil announcing its plans for restoration of a large area. I can't remember the number now, but a very large area of its ecosystems, and making the formal launch of that plan. I saw discussions around something called the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, which is a plan pushed by Brazil and Colombia in particular, and some other countries, to create a permanent fund to support tropical forests. Some controversies and debate around that, but that was one of the significant events I saw there. The other thing I'd say is actually, compared to climate COPs, I found it a much more enjoyable space, for one thing, but a much more radical space in terms of ideas. I think it's evolved perhaps in the tail of the climate COPs, but I think as part of that, it's opened much more to not only thinking on this very big macroeconomic Western view of tackling the problem as some sort of technocentric, system-centric approach. And so the space given to indigenous voices, to other ways of thinking, other world visions, was much, much more prominent and much more central than I've seen in climate COPs. And that came through even in some of the decisions, like to create a formal subsidiary body for indigenous voices to be represented in all subsequent discussions, which was a key outcome of this meeting. So it's a much more radical space than I had anticipated, and that also made it much more enjoyable. And the final thing I'll just mention is the third role I think that these COPs play, which is to just motivate public sense and culture around the larger goals. And I think in the climate ones, for example, I think the Glasgow COP played a huge role in creating more momentum in the UK around dealing with climate change, which I think carries on to now in some extenses. And I think this one played a role both in Colombia, but perhaps I think in all in Latin America, and really pushing forward this. And I was really struck at how many voices, the public participation in the green zone, how many caleños that I spoke to in the streets who were really got what the COP was about, and the broader message is there. And it had been it's been a risky decision to put this in Cali, which has a problematic history and reputation in many ways. And the Colombian government took a risk in putting it there. I think it paid off admirably, because you could feel the pride in the city around this happening there. And this amazing biodiversity hotspot within this amazingly biodiverse country that really benefited from that. I think that leaves a longer term legacy within Colombia, and hopefully beyond Colombia as well, in terms of really having a nature-centric view of how they move forward.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Devinda. Absolutely agree with all of that. I think the diversity of voices that were there, and the numbers of different indigenous groups from around the world that were represented, was really, really encouraging. And a number of different progressive conversations about rights for nature, for example, that was a big that was a big topic that was there in the action track. And yeah, I also amazing walking around Colombia, Cali, and seeing a lot of nature graffiti, some of it predating the COP, some of it because of the COP. And as you say, a heaving green zone was actually packed with Colombians, and that was really wonderful to see so much engagement. So hopefully we can, yeah, maybe with the Brazil COP, we can yeah, hope something similar, and hopefully a great sense as well of Latin American leadership on some of these issues, particularly the climate and nature synergies piece. But Hannah, over to you.
Yes.
You want to introduce yourself just in case people...
I will, and I'm also going to try and move this slide along that should be rolling. So I apologize to the people whose faces have been on this screen for quite some time. Let's see if they continue to roll. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Hannah Nicholas. I'm based in biology. I'm the coordinator of a project called Cascade, which is the Conservation and Sustainability Consortium of academic institutions. So we are a network of universities and higher education institutions in the UK, specifically targeted towards the CBD and the Global Biodiversity Framework, and how we can kind of do more effective knowledge exchange and bridge the gaps between academia and policy. So moving from some of those kind of broad takeaways from the experience at COP, we wanted to move now into some of the kind of key successes and failures from this COP. And I'm sure those of you that are interested have been following it in the news. So we're not going to kind of spend too long, because I'm sure you can read up about this. But to get us all kind of on the same page, we thought that we would give a quick overview of some of the key achievements and failures from this COP. So as I see it, there were kind of 4 big ticket items at this COP. One of those was DSI, digital sequence information. One of those was resource mobilization and finance. The other was Article 8J, which is on traditional knowledge and Indigenous rights. And then the final one was on the monitoring framework. So of those 4, the way that it progressed was that I think we can say 2 had some level of success and 2 had quite a lot of failure, in the sense that, so with DSI, digital sequence information, there were some successes in this. I wasn't personally following it myself, and there might be some people in the room here from our delegation that followed it more closely than I did, who will be able to chip in to our discussion on that. But kind of the key takeaways is that genetic data from nature, there has been a fund called the Cali Fund created so that we can transfer resources for genetic data, basically. So this is a voluntary fund, so businesses don't have to pay, but there is a fund set up so that hopefully we can have some kind of benefit sharing for the access of genetic resources. So that was a win from this COP. Another big win, which Melissa is going to talk about a little more, is on Article 8J, so I'll leave that one for now. But the 2 big things that we could see as kind of pretty big failures are on resource mobilization and the monitoring framework. So you will see in this slideshow some pictures coming around of kind of the final negotiations, which went on until 8:30 in the morning. The day after COP was due to end. So we were supposed to finish, I don't know, 8 p.m. in the evening. Never happens that way. Of course, it always does go late into the early hours of the morning. But with this COP in particular, on DSI, we were very stuck the whole 2 weeks. Eventually, there was a president's text produced, which basically is a group of friends of the chair produce an overall text that they then put forward to all the parties in the final plenary to be signed off. But this took kind of until 4 a.m. This final text was put through to plenary, then took 2 more hours of negotiations before they officially finally signed that one off. And at this point, they'd kind of tried to tick off all of the easier items in this final plenary to push them through, but left the items that they felt would be more contentious. That was the tactic anyway, but it kind of failed in the end because it meant that resource mobilization and finance and the monitoring framework were left until they weren't discussed until 7 a.m. in the morning after nearly 24 hours of negotiations, at which point many of the parties had left and we ended up with no quorum, which means the minimum number of people that you need for the negotiations to go ahead. So the whole COP had to be suspended, basically with no agreements on monitoring or finance, which are obviously two pretty fundamental topics for the global biodiversity framework. So in that sense, not great. How long do I have, Matt? Close to finish. Okay, well, there you go. There's your overview and just 10 seconds on my role at COP. Through Cascade, we were kind of doing a lot of work inside events and bilateral conversations with people to see how we can kind of help academics more effectively engage with the global biodiversity framework to support implementation of the GBF. So do talk to me about that if you wish. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, well, first I'm just gonna briefly introduce myself. I'm Melissa Felipe. I'm the program coordinator of the Biodiversity and Society program from the Oxford Martin School. And as part of my role, I also collaborate with the Women Caucus, which is one of the constituencies from the UNCBD COP. So I was also part of the policy team for the Women Caucus, and that's why I was following different items from a human rights-based approach and also from a gender justice perspective. As Hannah mentioned, one of the key outcomes of COP was the subsidiary body on Article AJ. And what this means is like COP used to have a working group on Article AJ, which addresses traditional knowledges, practices, and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. But now that's moved on to a subsidiary body, which is going to be a group that gathers like every 2 years and have decisions and draft propositions for the text in COP. And also a good thing that comes from this is that now countries have to nominate a national focal point to interact with COP CBD, with other constituencies about what are they proposing into the MBSAPs. So there's like a contact point to address these engagements of IPLCs, which is really good. Together with this, we have the new program of work. The new program of work on Article AJ supports the work of the subsidiary body, which means that they have agreed on certain tasks that they are gonna carry throughout these 2 years until COP17. And it's mostly to like just keep the IPLCs engaged and keep a monitor of the decisions and how they are being implemented by parties, so they have like a real influence and advocacy within the text. There's 3 other decisions that were adopted under this item 14 that have been not really talked about, but I think they are really important. One of them is the recognition of peoples of Afro-descendant background, and that they need to have traditional lifestyles. This was pushed very hard by the Colombian party, but also by Brazil and some other Latin American countries. And that was finally decided. And then we have 2 other decisions, that is the recommended permanent forum of indigenous issues, which means, I don't know, well, for the ones that are not very aware of this, but inside of the discussion of IPLCs, there is a discussion on separating them. So naming it differently, indigenous people separated from local communities. And that, of course, have an impact on how these decisions are implemented by countries and what does that mean for rights. So what happened here is that now the Secretariat is going to inform particularly indigenous communities on the decisions that they are doing and the actions that they are carrying out throughout these 2 years and forward. And the last one is the role of language in intergenerational and traditional knowledge, how this is transferred throughout the years. This text was almost not discussed at all. It was already agreed in previous sessions as SBI, so it was passed really easily, which was good. And then we are going to see that also how this is addressed within the subsidiary body, which is going to be in charge of all these issues. And this is everything about item 14. If you have any questions, I can go in depth a little bit more. I think I have a couple of minutes more. So just a quick reflection on how do I see personally from my role in the Women Caucus on how was the human rights approach addressed within the whole negotiations and in different items. I think we had overall a positive balance, like these key decisions were really powerful and means a lot for the implementation of the GBF. However, there's still some things in the negotiation rooms that are not great. So because in Montreal, it was agreed Section C and different targets related to gender and inclusive participations, there was this sense in the room that we couldn't add more text that is language specific on human rights or gender justice. So I think that's a problem because it stops countries to actually have a sense of what you have to do at a national level. If you just make reference to Section C or Target 23, it's harder for countries to mobilize resources and to actually know what to do on the ground. And then moving forward for COP17 and the issues that are pending as resource mobilization and monitoring framework, there's still some battles to be fought, I would say. In terms of gender, we still need to know about disaggregation data for the monitoring framework and the direct access of funding, not only resources, but funding specifically for IPLCs, women and youth. Yeah,
Brilliant,
that's it.
thank you. That's great, well done, thank you. I'm sure people may have questions for Melissa, but we'll move on to Audrey now.
Great. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Audrey Wagner, I work as program coordinator and researcher at the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. This was my second biodiversity COP, but my fifth COP overall. So I had been to a few climate COPs before. And yeah, I agree with Yadvinder. This was kind of the most amazing one yet, because it was like a really good kind of vibe and yeah, felt quite inclusive and everything. I'm going to talk about two different hats that I had at this COP. So firstly, in terms of following the negotiations, the particular negotiation track that I was following was the one on biodiversity and climate change. So the one on kind of synergies between these two great big global crises, right? And so this kind of negotiation text had been actually on the table for, or a version of it had been on the table for COP15, so 2 years ago in Montreal, and had actually failed and not passed. So because it was kind of 2 years overdue, and also in the kind of civil society space all around the world, there's been so much momentum on really kind of improving policy coherence around climate and biodiversity synergies, there was a lot of momentum for this agenda item to be ambitious and to be passed. And it was also one of the priority items for the COP president's kind of personal interest as well. So in the end, the text did go through. It was a success. It passed. But of course, with all of these things as negotiations go, there's always going to be kind of nuances, pros and cons, things that went well and not so well with the text that passed. So firstly, first of all, it did pass, and the text is more or less decent and ambitious. So that's kind of a success in itself, that it didn't fail again. But there were a few kind of issues with it that we saw. So one of the things was that there was in some previous drafts mention of fossil fuels. So the reference of the need to transition away from fossil fuels in the text, unfortunately, that was removed. So that definitely kind of shows a lower level of ambition. In addition, another thing that was removed from the text was reference to the kind of risks and dangers around bioenergy. And because we're talking, of course, here about the kind of different synergies and trade-offs between tackling climate change, climate action, and biodiversity. And so there was a paragraph in there about the risks of bioenergy to biodiversity. And people were very disappointed that was removed. So that was definitely seen as a loss. A couple of other things happened in these negotiations. So one thing that we actually saw, it wasn't necessarily specific to this text because we're seeing this across different negotiations, was that some parties wanted to remove reference to 1.5. So they wanted to just reference the Paris temperature goals instead of kind of specifically referencing 1.5. We can kind of speculate why one would want to do that, probably to kind of be less accountable, right? In the end, mention of 1.5 did get into this text, but it was kind of bizarre that was such a hard fought battle, right? You would think that would be so basic. So hours and hours were actually lost kind of debating on 1.5. And actually, this speaks to some of my other hat that I was playing in the negotiations that I'll talk about in a second. But as a kind of group of academics, we actually supported providing some kind of evidence, so just kind of citations from IPBES and IPCC reports on why it was important to keep that text in there, which then parties were able to kind of bring to the negotiation table and say, hey, we have kind of this specific, wording in the IPCC, etc. This is why it should stay on the table. So that brings me to the other hat that I was kind of playing in these negotiations. So we heard already from Melissa that she was part of the Women's Caucus, and so she mentioned a little bit how there's these different kind of stakeholder constituencies, right? So the Women's Caucus is one of them. Some other ones include youth. So the Global Youth Biodiversity Network is a very important one. There's also the IIFB, which is a group of kind of the official group representing Indigenous peoples to the CBD. So those are kind of potentially like rights holder groups, but then there's also some other ones like NGOs and academics. So there is a kind of official group to the CBD that is meant to represent academia and research. It has been kind of more active over the past couple of years, and Hannah and I have been leading and coordinating this group, which over the past kind of year or so, which has been really, really exciting. And so there's a lot of kind of potential for the group to grow, and we have a lot of kind of plans for it, but we were able to kind of achieve and do some exciting things at this COP with the group. So essentially it has kind of several different functions, but what it can really do is help to support, for instance, academics and researchers who are potentially new to the negotiations, who maybe don't know so much about what is kind of really happening. We have morning meetings where people can come and kind of debrief on what's happening with the negotiations and share intel, etc. That was one of our roles. Also through kind of a WhatsApp chat, we were able to kind of talk about different things happening in the negotiations, and as I mentioned, kind of support different kind of gaps in the negotiation space. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm probably at time, but yeah, let's have a great discussion.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, and just to say, I was walking around with Audrey and the team were there for several days before I got there. And I got there and I was walking around with Audrey, and it was extraordinary. Not only did she seem to know absolutely everybody at the COP, but it was we made slow progress. But lots of people from this academic group saying, thank you for doing this. Thank you for organising us. So, and that happened several times. People were superbly good. So there's a real sort of sense that it's really needed. There's hundreds of academics there, as you say, and some sort of building a sense of community, and not least which, if a question came up that was related to the negotiations, so those of us that were closer to the negotiations then had this incredible pool of great minds. So it's sort of, it was really inspiring. So yeah, well done for that, because it wasn't easy, was it? There was quite hard work, as you can imagine, and wearing multiple hats. It is a very, very busy, and there's lots going on. So I think there are several of you in the audience who are also at COP. So if you would like to, make some observations from your perspective, then now is the time. And or if any of you have got questions for anybody who is there or has been looking at this, then please go ahead.
Resource mobilization.
Were you going to speak to?
Well, if there's, I think, I could say some words on resource mobilization.
Yeah, I mean, is there a question about the research mobilization piece that maybe we could tailor an answer to? I'm just mindful of time and wanting everyone in the audience to get a. No.
Just like one
Yeah.
short point.
Yeah. Sure.
Just in terms of where things are, I think there's several strong indications coming that the COP's going to reconvene in the next few months. So a lot of that unfinished business isn't kicked back for 1 or 2 years. Hopefully it'll be solved in February or March time, something. So the process is still rolling forward. It isn't just hasn't fallen off a cliff for a year or two, as you might get a sense.
Yeah, to add to that, because some of the key things that were not finalized are quite crucial, including the budget for the Secretariat, as well as the resource mobilization. So there are things that literally cannot wait. Otherwise, we can't move forwards. So that's why they will likely have to reconvene, but we don't know how that will look, whether it'll be online, in person, how people will fund themselves to get there. If it's another meeting, we don't really know. But yeah.
I think just following that idea that things haven't stopped until next COP, for resource mobilization and for the monitoring framework, there's 2 papers that are going to be discussed. So it's not starting from scratch. There's already decisions and suggestions for the text that is going to be approved. But I think a very contentious point in the resource mobilization one is about who is going to manage these funds. So far, we have 2 funds. One is related to the Global Biodiversity Fund and another one on the Kunming Montreal Fund. So I think there's quite like a division. I think a lot of global South countries are pushing forward to have this fund managed by CBD and not by GEF, which is currently the one that is managing these funds. And global North countries prefer to stay with that structure. There's been some studies about how GAF has been allocating these funds and like how the projects have been going on. And yeah, so there's still some gaps on how these funds are being allocated within countries. So there's been certain complaints, and that's why there's this division. And I think that's going to be the main thing that is going to be addressed when the discussions resume.
Thank you. So any questions? Yeah, one at the back. We just got the one mic.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Yes, sorry, I don't know if I missed it, but I just wondered if you could repeat the decision that was made about indigenous, the definition of indigenous and traditional peoples.
Really? Oh, sorry. It won't.
Michael just. Oh, okay. I'll just stand. I was also at COP16, but I was mainly following the 30 by 30 area-based conservation target, among other things. And I'll just give maybe 2 minutes, just a quick highlight of what I observed. And 30 by 30 has been quite contentious right from the previous COP. And much as the biodiversity framework was adopted, there were still some gaps that remained with this particular target. And at COP16, the discussion still continued. And most of the times I was just moving around following sessions that were focused on the 30 by 30 target. But what was what kept hanging, or the most contentious bit, was who exactly will support to make the 30 by 30 to accomplish the 30%. Because right now, if you look at the global statistic, it's about 18% of the lands that are being protected. And then for the oceans, it's close to about 8.5%. But what do we have to do to achieve the 30% by 2030? Yet we have only 6 years left. But again, there are lots of discussions and questions about rights, because there's this, and most protected areas around the world have this history of eviction. But if you want to involve more people, then you might need to get them more involved. There are lots of discussions of getting people to actually now protect and conserve the lands they use. But we need to acknowledge that there are changes in land use systems whereby land is not only in communities spaces, but there are also private owned lands. So lots of discussions and contentions around this still existed. And during COP16, there was also the launch of the Protected Planet Report, which gave much more detail of this statistic. And also during COP16, there was a guideline that was released on other effective area-based conservation measures, because the argument is that we cannot achieve 30% within the remaining 6 years if we continue by this model. But if we look at other effective area-based conservation measures, we might be able to do that. But a number of countries or a number of people from around the world have reservations as to the use of OECMs, because others think it locks a box because there are guidelines that are being set up for that. And during COP16, a set of guidelines was launched. It was co-developed by the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas and also with the CBD Secretariat. So this was on the 30 by 30 Action Day. And this proposes a number of guidelines, but most importantly, it noted that whereas it is defined as OECMs and several countries have different definitions. For example, in Uganda, some of them are called community wildlife areas. It just sets a list of management regimes that people should take into account. But also what was noted is that so much focus has been put on land, so much focus has been put on the seascapes. But how about the terrestrial water systems, the hydrology that exists within these places? So there was also a report that was released that was giving guidelines on how inland waters should be managed and help contribute towards this target. Again, these are discussions that keep going on. There are also discussions on the relevance of ICCAs. These are areas that are not officially recognized as protected areas, but are being protected and conserved by local communities. As of course you might know or might not know yet, there are lots of arguments that areas where communities are stewards are actually better conserved and protected than the ones that are state-run and conserved. So these discussions still keep going on, and as per the next steps, definitely a number of moving forward. Not so many things were resolved upon, but moving forward, one of the things being done is a set of clear indicators to actually track and monitor progress towards achieving the 30 by 30 targets. And I think that's one of the things that's still going on from the side of target 3. Again, there's so much I could share about it, but I think I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I just had a question about narratives at COP, because it feels like at the moment that kind of climate and biodiversity are best friends and we're like this. But I'm thinking about pollution and how present you felt like that discussion was either in the negotiations or in the informal discussions that you were having. Obviously, I know that it's kind of instilled in Target 7. But yeah, just thinking about integration between different types of MEAs. So for instance, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants or the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Just interested to know about that.
Okay, and then we'll take the question on cooperation.
Yeah.
And then we'll take a question on online.
Okay, good. Yeah, it was approved, but what it was approved is that the permanent forum, so the secretariat is going to inform IFB about the decisions that they're making towards indigenous peoples, but that doesn't mean that it's going to affect local communities' rights. It's just that they're going to have the permanent forum. But it doesn't change. Like it's gonna be throughout the text, it's still gonna be IPLCs, and they're like addressed as a package until now.
Okay. Great. And Audrey, do you wanna?
Yeah, and I can speak a little bit about your question, because there was an agenda item. It was noted agenda item 13 on cooperation, and so that spoke more that basically spoke about the convention's cooperation with other MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements, and beyond. And so in that text, I think I was wanted to be following it, but in the end I didn't have time to kind of really follow it very, very closely. But I'm pretty sure they make reference to the one on Mercury, and they make reference to a whole bunch of MEAs. I'm pretty sure pollution is included in that. But actually, that was one of the texts that didn't pass, right? Because they ran out of time. So that even though, you know, potentially it probably would have passed, because I don't think that things were really, really that stuck with it if there had been enough time. But yeah, it was late in the agenda. So it's going to be one of those things that are still being negotiated in when kind of COP16 resumes, because of course we, as you guys said, COP16 has not stopped. It's actually just suspended. So COP16 will actually resume, right? But yeah, the draft text is on the CBD website, so you can read the draft text for item 13 on cooperation there. So that probably answers part of your question, not so much on kind of the overall narratives throughout the COP, more specifically on the negotiations, but yeah.
Great.
Oh,
Thank you. Did you? Yeah. Okay.
Something quick to add, and this might be relevant to everyone in the room as well, that I didn't touch on as one of the key things. But something that would be of interest to academics, I think, is the scientific and technical needs to support the convention. And so there was a lot of back and forth. There were 5 agreed. You can go and look at the text as well. But one of those is biodiversity and pollution has been identified as an area where further work is needed and where scientific and technical support is needed. So the Secretariat have asked for help with biodiversity and pollution, because I think you're right that biodiversity climate has had a lot of thought, but biodiversity pollution and other areas not as much. So that's one of the 5 key areas. Another is biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. One is, I think, like biodiversity sustainable activities, or something that I don't really understand. Sustainable biodiversity based activities. And then the final 2, one's on equity and gender rights, and the last one is on diverse value systems. So those final 2, the first 3, they agreed pretty easily. Those final 2 on equity and value systems, they went back and forth a lot, and there was a lot of bargaining going on between certain parties to get the brackets lifted on those 2, but they did make it through in the end. So those are the 5 areas of the scientific and technical support needs that could be interesting for people to think about.
And just briefly on that, just to highlight how well respected IPBES is by the negotiators and those supporting the negotiators. So in terms of sort of getting good evidence into policy making in this space, really engaging with IPBES, lots of brilliant people involved with that, I think is a really, really important thing to flag. And I went to a wonderful presentation by some colleagues on the IPBES process and how to get involved. And I really do think if you want your research to influence the negotiations, then follow all of this and look at the decision text and sort of, there's lots of different ways of doing that, but more engagement by all of us in IPBES. Maybe some of you are already deeply engaged, but for those who aren't, I think we should be doing more, working more on that, because it's a mechanism, a well-respected mechanism for getting science into, getting evidence into that process. So more questions or observations that those of you who, oh yeah, there's one online. Let's go for that. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm going to combine these questions from Johanna and William, which is about monitoring. So again, just to clarify, what were the main questions of monitoring of biodiversity that were left on the table and what was contentious? And from William, what are we lacking in terms of the monitoring framework and how do we efficiently, work towards a solution without duplicating each other's work and getting overwhelmed? I don't know who wants to speak to monitoring.
I can, and I also see some people in the audience that have been following monitoring that might be able to add as well. So on the monitoring framework, I mean, following the negotiations throughout on monitoring, there was a real hesitance for anything new to be added. So the parties were keen not to include any additional indicators on anything, despite the fact that the monitoring framework is pretty lacking in many areas across many targets. So the kind of general consensus was taking things away actually from the monitoring framework rather than bolstering it and supporting it and making it stronger. So it was quite frustrating one to watch, and it went round in circles. And I think that's why it was left to the end, because they knew it was not going to be straightforward. But I'm going to pass over. I see that you're magically here today. Do you want to talk about monitoring a little more?
Yeah, so I went to COP16 with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, just down the road in Wallingford. And I was following item 10, the monitoring framework. And yeah, it really did go around in circles. And there was a lot of issues with it. The main issue are the nations, there's this idea of a global review, which is how they might respond on their targets and indicators, but there's no nation wants to sign up for a global review that they don't understand what it's going to be, how it's going, what format it's going to be in, all the components of it. But that wasn't meant to be part of the discussion. So everything kept coming back to the global review, and then every nation would get nervous of putting anything in the text about the global review because they don't know what it's going to be. So they don't want all the indicators to represent or be held accountable for indicators that they don't know how they're going to be processed. And yeah, as you said, the indicators got stripped back. And I mean, to be fair, science can't really agree on the best ways to monitor biodiversity. So I don't see how they were going to be in a position to agree on a set of indicators to globally monitor biodiversity. But it's like a long way behind where it needs to be. And I think there's huge amounts of work that need to be done there, both in the science and in the policy arenas for that item in the monitoring framework.
Any other?
Steps in. My question was also about the monitoring and the global review, and what, in your opinion, how can the research community support, and which are the big organizations that will be leading this discussion around the global review, I guess?
Let's do it while I'm here.
Thank you. I was also virtually following the climate and biodiversity stuff, and that you mentioned the bioenergy was left out. What was interesting was it wasn't completely left out, but the concerns about bioenergy affecting biodiversity, they just substituted that with geoengineering, which I thought was a bit strange. And then later on, it wasn't actually in the SPS TTA proposal, but they added this extra section about really encouraging ocean fertilization. And I was kind of confused about where that came from, why that was so relevant in this COP. It just seemed a bit strange, and I wondered if someone who was in the negotiations saw what the story was behind that.
Thank you.
There you go.
Hi, yeah, this is just a quick one. It's not really a question, just more to share my experience. So I was attending COP16 as well, representing nature positive universities. And just really to emphasize what Yadvinder said about the sort of action track and the legacy that COP can leave on a city. And I think we found with nature positive universities, we actually launched our initiative at the last COP15 in Montreal in 2022. And we found that following that, the universities that committed to our initiative in Montreal are still going really strong as a network working together. So they're probably some of the most ambitious in our network, working specifically to look at supply chains involved with their universities and how they can work together within their city. And we found the same thing at this COP. We had a group of 16 Colombian universities based in the Cali region who all launched a declaration to work together and cooperate on biodiversity, specifically looking at the city of Cali and connectivity and ecological monitoring of their city. So that's just a really positive on the ground thing that will keep going. We'll be working with them, sort of connecting in monthly to see how they're progressing. We had a lot of interest from students to take action and sign up. So just another thing to say, even though it seems like a huge conference and a lot of talking and a lot of people flying out there, I think there are real tangible things on the ground that get left. And the Green Zone, was a really inspiring place to be. Yeah, thank you.
The sense that I had is that there was actually something reasonable on the table on monitoring and metrics. So there was some hope that it would. But do you have any insight? I don't, but do you have any insights on where that got to and what might be agreed? And then what we can do as a science community, those of us working on indicators and metrics to help support this.
Yeah, we did get somewhere. I followed most of the contact groups. So I think from my perspective, it was frustrating because I'm seeing so many things being stripped away. I don't know how much you know about the monitoring framework, but there's a series of different indicators. They have headline, binary, component, and complementary indicators. And those last two are optional. They're just listed as indicators that countries can use if they wish to. And I think the really frustrating part was a lot of those optional indicators even were stripped away. And there were two schools of thought, one that they didn't want indicators they didn't understand how to use, and others saying, but those countries that do wish to use those indicators should have them there as an option. Otherwise, they can basically just choose any indicators anyway that aren't even within the monitoring framework. And so it was quite a frustrating conversation. It eventually, I mean, a lot didn't get through, but they did end up with some kind of framework, still one that has gaps from my perspective, that is where the scientific community, I think, can do more to support the creation of potentially new indicators that fit within that framework. But it's a question of whether they will in February. Actually, in February, they certainly won't be adopting new ones, I don't think, but this is longer term thinking, how we can support the monitoring framework. And I think that work needs to happen in the intersessionals between the COPs, because what we saw at this COP was that they did not want to be adopting new things at the COP. So if you have relationships with parties and stakeholders that you can start to talk to now about their needs, and that you can start to think about some of the gaps in the monitoring framework as it currently stands, that work needs to be happening well in advance, basically, would be my perspective on it. But anything else to add? We've drawn you into our panel here.
Just a little bit mindful of the time, because it would be good to get to maybe one or two more questions from the audience. So if you could be brief, although I know it's a gigantic topic.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that there's a few groups that are trying to position themselves for influencing indicators, like the Biodiversity Indicator Partnership, that has a lot that's trying to be part of the monitoring framework, and it's not really clear exactly which ones will be included or how they'll change over time. But yeah, no, I think there's needed for coordination. GeoBond were also present at COP and were heavily involved in trying to say that they can monitor biodiversity globally, and I don't think we're in a position to do that well yet, but I think we need to have these indicators so that we can monitor progress and track progress against targets.
Just on that one very briefly, and especially as it was your question, Cecile, I mean, we haven't talked at all about what was going on in the green zone with the private sector, lots and lots of conversations about metrics. And I think these public-private partnerships with the government and the private sector, particularly, say, around TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and work in that space is incredibly important. And sort of as a community, you know, we tend to sow more chaos by saying, oh, it's very complicated and all these different metrics. We know that biodiversity is very place-based, and we're never going to get a perfect metric that works for everywhere. We're not even going to get a perfect set of metrics that work for everywhere, but that's okay, as Cecile is, you know, keen on sharing. And I hope you don't mind me, there's lots we can be getting on with. We know what bad looks like. We know more or less where the red lines are. So actually some sort of agreement or emerging consensus in the scientific community around this very issue that, you know, I think would be kind of useful, rather than sort of putting more and more and more indicators out there, because there's a potentially infinite number of indicators, because every bit of land or every bit of sea is different when it comes to biodiversity. So some clearer messaging perhaps this coming year around that might be quite useful, and we should all probably get our brains together on that one. Because we're worried about that. You were saying, Cecile, when I talked to you, worried about this, the quest for the perfect metric, the quest for the perfect indicator could just stall action on the ground indefinitely, when we already know what good looks like in many cases, and we should be getting on with that. Does anyone else have any observations or questions that they want in the final minute of this that they want to raise, or any sort of hopes, next steps, anything like that? Online, yeah.
A question from Sandra Diaz. Was there any explanation or feeling as to why so many countries have not yet submitted their national strategies?
Hello, Sandra. Thank you very much for your question, and wonderful that you've been tuning in. I certainly don't have any intelligence on that. Does anyone else who was there? Obviously a big push. We need to really push this year, and particularly push sort of for alignment between the NBSAPs and the NDCs. Some countries are doing good work on that. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can just kind of cite the reasons that the parties, you know, gave in plenary, which were not enough time. It was kind of, you know, to develop an NBSAP, you need to have different consultations, you know, from the ground up. If you want it to be done right, you need to do it kind of from the ground up. That involves consultations, etc. And obviously the GBF is complex, so kind of there wasn't enough time between the time that the GBF was agreed and then, so they're kind of ongoing but not ready yet. And of course, lack of finance, lack of resources. This is citing what the parties themselves said. You know, we can kind of speculate, is it kind of how much of that is excuses and how much of that is real? But yeah, I don't know if you guys had anything to say on that.
Yeah, no, on the reasons why, but I think it's also good to look at the quality of the NBSAPs that have been submitted. And yeah, in the page of the CBD, you have like a tool where like the parties submit their NBSAP, and then you can filter through targets to see if they're addressing the 23 targets or not, which ones, and then it's like you can run an analysis. It's like very, very interesting, as well as the WWF tracker of MBSAPs as well. They've done a really good job about quality of MBSAPs, so it will be like if you're interested to look at it.
Quick comment on the UK perspective. Sure, the UK also failed to submit, and their reason was political chaos the last year, which I think is legitimate, and a new government still trying to get its feet under the desk. So I think, but I got a sense from talking to the UK delegation that there was a lot of goodwill and momentum about that. I think with part of it was part of the new government also understanding the international agenda, and I think they got it. I think there was a sense of Steve Reed and others sort of really embracing it, being a little bit overwhelmed by it perhaps at the start, but overall, I think overall there were good signals from the UK government about this, despite the need to catch up and get some speed on that.
Of course, the UK has a special representative for nature now in Ruth Davies, who's an absolutely extraordinary, wonderful person. So that will hopefully help things. Hopefully that's been useful, or at least interesting. I hope we can all stay in touch as this year unfolds and work together more. I think actually visiting, I think you're right, Melissa, visiting the CBD website. I mean, it's not the best website in the world. It's not the worst either, though. It's definitely not the worst. It's got better. And I think it's just, possibly we should all sort of at least look at these texts, and then we can better understand, and also better understand. It's easy to get frustrated that things are glacially slow, and I think you did a brilliant job even at the beginning saying, these are just incredibly difficult things. And I had the privilege of sitting next to a colleague who really studies international global governance, and she sort of explained that the significance that each of these bracketed words means in terms of responsibility, finance, historical complexities. This is very complex, but certainly all the materials there, you can see what's still on the table, what was agreed, and engage. And what was really nice about this COP, certainly compared in my experience anyway to the climate COP, is how close these we could attend contact groups, you could watch the negotiations, you could by being there you could help feed. There were little windows of opportunities to help feed some good evidence through to the negotiators. It didn't necessarily always manifest in changes in the text or removal of brackets, but it was really nice to be there to feel that there was at least the potential for that, which there doesn't often seem to be. That the climate COP, this one is more open to that. So I think it was really interesting from that point of view. But yeah, great, good. Is there anything else anyone wants to say? Yes, yeah, of course.
Some things that came just promoting next term. We have a couple of relevant things. Andy Gonzalez, who's the director of GeoBond, will be talking here in February, and also next term we're going to have a half-day workshop on how science and biodiversity data, this question of metrics, how we can both contribute to that and use that as well. And then in March, David Cooper, who's the secretary of the COP, will be talking, hopefully after the February meetings all happen, and giving us a final washout about his reflections on the whole process. And he's been right at the heart of this process, both in this meeting, but for many previous meetings as well.
Really good.
Drinks in the East Lab after here.